On the 7th of April, 1937, Milton Hershey watched from the second floor of High Point Mansion as his town tore itself apart. He was 80 years old. Below him, thousands of farmers and loyal workers stormed his chocolate factory with fists, shoes, clubs, and ice picks. They were beating the men who had occupied the building for 5 days. The strikers had demanded higher wages and union recognition. The farmers wanted the milk flowing again. 240,000 quarts had spoiled on the factory floor, enough milk to fill more than 1,600 bathtubs. Enough loss to justify violence. Hershey had built this town. He had provided houses, schools, parks, jobs during the Depression. He had given most of his fortune to orphaned boys. He had constructed a model of benevolent capitalism on a hill overlooking central Pennsylvania. And now his workers were being dragged from his factory and beaten in the street while he watched from a mansion he no longer owned. High Point stood on 27 acres above the chocolate factory, 22 rooms, modest for a man worth millions. Milton had built it in 1908 for his wife Catherine. She died 7 years later. He lived there alone for 15 years, then gave it away to a country club. He kept a small apartment on the second floor. From that apartment, he could see everything: his factory, his workers, his town, his legacy consuming itself. This is the story of High Point Mansion. Not the chocolate empire we celebrate, the control we forgot, the cost nobody counted. Milton Hershey was born in 1857 with nothing. By 1900, he had everything. The path between those 2 points was failure. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Failed. By age 26, Milton Snavely Hershey was penniless. He had started 3 businesses. All had failed. He owed money to his family. He owed money to suppliers. He had no prospects and no plan beyond desperation. This was 1883. In another 17 years, he would sell a candy company for $1 million. But in 1883, he could not afford to eat. Hershey was born on the 13th of September, 1857, on a farm outside Derry Church, Pennsylvania. His father, Henry Hershey, was a dreamer who chased schemes that never materialized. Oil speculation, land deals, patent medicines. Each venture consumed what little money the family had. Each ended in failure. By 1867, Henry had largely abandoned his wife and son. The details of the separation are unclear, but Veronica Hershey, called Fanny, had grown tired of her husband's incompetence. Fanny was the daughter of a Mennonite clergyman. She was strict, frugal, and deeply suspicious of ambition. Her husband's dreams had brought poverty. She would teach her son to value work over imagination. Milton attended 7 different schools as the family moved across Pennsylvania Dutch country. By the time he was old enough for an apprenticeship, he had completed perhaps a 4th-grade education. Fanny believed books had ruined her husband. She would not let them ruin her son. At age 13, Milton was apprenticed to a newspaper editor in Gap, Pennsylvania. The work involved setting type for a German-language publication. Milton hated it. He was clumsy with the equipment. After a few months, he dropped his straw hat into the printing press. He was fired. His mother found him a different apprenticeship with Joseph Royer, a confectioner in Lancaster. Milton learned to make caramels, fudge, and peppermints. He discovered he had a talent for it. At 19 in 1876, Milton moved to Philadelphia to start his own candy business. The timing seemed perfect. Philadelphia was hosting the Centennial Exposition, America's first World's Fair. Millions of visitors would pass through the city. Milton borrowed money from his uncle and opened a shop selling candy, nuts, and ice cream. He worked 12-hour days. He made good product. It did not matter. After 6 years, the business collapsed. He could not pay his suppliers. His family's money was gone. Milton traveled west. In Denver, he found work with a local confectioner who taught him something crucial. Fresh milk made better caramels. The technique was simple but uncommon. Milton absorbed the lesson and moved on. He tried starting businesses in Chicago and New Orleans. Both failed. He arrived in New York City in 1883 with nothing. He started another candy company. It lasted 3 years. When it failed, he had lost everything. Hershey returned to Lancaster in 1886. He was 29 years old. He had failed at every business he had attempted. His father had abandoned the family. His mother had sacrificed her savings. He had no education, no capital, and no reason to believe this time would be different. But he remembered what he had learned in Denver. Fresh milk makes good caramels. The Lancaster Caramel Company began in a small shop. Hershey made caramels using the fresh milk technique. The product was superior to what competitors offered. It melted in the mouth. A British candy importer placed a large order. Hershey needed money to buy ingredients. He approached the Lancaster National Bank for a loan. The bank's cashier, impressed by Hershey's determination, backed the loan with his own signature. When the British payment arrived, Hershey ran down the street to the bank with his apron still on. The Lancaster Caramel Company became extraordinarily successful. By 1894, Hershey employed more than 1,300 workers in 2 factories. He was considered one of Lancaster's most substantial citizens. At age 37, he finally had money to spend. He purchased a large home on South Queen Street. He filled it with exotic birds, plants, and mementos from his travels. For the first time in his life, Milton Hershey could buy what he wanted. He later said, "It's my money," if anyone questioned his spending. Success brought connections. Through the caramel business, Hershey met industrialists and financiers. He worked briefly as secretary to Pierre S. DuPont, heir to the chemical fortune. From DuPont, Hershey learned how corporate finance worked at scale, how investments could multiply, how mass production could transform industries. In 1893, Hershey attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He saw German chocolate-making machinery on display. He bought the equipment and had it shipped to Lancaster. Hershey began experimenting with chocolate while his caramel business boomed. He produced over 100 varieties. But by the late 1890s, he recognized that chocolate, not caramel, was the future. Specifically, milk chocolate. The Swiss had perfected milk chocolate, but it remained expensive. Hershey believed he could mass produce it and sell it cheaply. He developed what became known as the Hershey process, which was less sensitive to milk quality than European methods. In 1900, he sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million to focus entirely on chocolate. The sale stunned everyone. Hershey was walking away from proven success to chase an uncertain idea, but he had learned something from his years of failure. Timing mattered, mass production mattered, and fresh milk, which had saved him once, would save him again. He would build a chocolate factory in the Pennsylvania countryside where milk was abundant. He would create milk chocolate that ordinary Americans could afford. He would build a town around his factory where workers could live decent lives. Hershey had also learned something from Pierre DuPont about how the wealthy operated. DuPont had shown him that fortunes could be reinvested, that businesses could grow beyond their founders, that installment payment plans could make expensive products accessible to the middle class. Hershey would later develop his own version of _1_ financing. The concept seemed obvious in hindsight. At the time, it was revolutionary. Chocolate gave Hershey his real fortune, but it would also cost him everything that mattered. In 1898, Milton Hershey, now 40 years old, did something that astounded everyone. He married a beautiful Irish Catholic girl from New York State. She was 26. She would be dead in 17 years. Chapter 2. The Wife Who Brought Color. Catherine Sweeney was working at a confectionery shop in Jamestown, New York, when she met Milton Hershey. He was selling caramels. She was selling ribbons and candy. The exact circumstances of their meeting are not recorded, but what followed was clear. Milton, reserved and serious, fell for a woman who was neither. Catherine was Irish Catholic, vivacious and opinionated. She wore red slippers and elaborate hats. She spoke her mind. Milton was Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonite, 41 years old and wealthy. She was 26 and working class. The marriage should not have worked. They were married on the 25th of May, 1898, in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. No grand ceremony, no society witnesses. Just a Catholic priest and 2 people who had decided quickly that they belonged together. Milton brought her back to Lancaster. The traditional Mennonite community was shocked. Women later recalled trying to catch glimpses of the new Mrs. Hershey when she stepped outside, hoping to see her red slippers or latest dress ensemble. Catherine, to her credit, did not adjust herself for Lancaster. She hosted dinner parties. She decorated their home with color. Where Milton was austere, Catherine was vibrant. By 1900, Milton had sold his caramel company and was focusing on chocolate. He had purchased land 30 miles northwest of Lancaster, near his birthplace in Derry Township. The land was farmland. There was no town. There was barely a village. Milton's wife thought he had lost his mind. When he told her he planned to build a chocolate factory in the middle of nowhere, she reportedly said he ought to have his head examined. But Milton had a plan. The Pennsylvania countryside offered everything he needed: fresh milk from surrounding dairy farms, access to rail lines, water from natural springs, industrious workers who would appreciate steady employment. He would build a factory. He would build a town. He would build a model community where workers could own homes, send their children to good schools, and live with dignity. Other industrialists built factories in cities and let workers fend for themselves in tenements. Milton would do better. Ground was broken for the chocolate factory in 1903. Construction proceeded rapidly. The factory would be massive, modern, and equipped with the latest machinery. While the factory rose, Milton and Catherine made plans for a house. In 1903, shortly after construction began, land was surveyed on a hilltop site above the factory. The location was deliberate. From the elevated position, Milton could overlook his factory and the town that would grow around it. He hired C. Emlyn Urban, a noted Lancaster architect, to design the house. Urban was already designing the factory and most of the major buildings for the new community. The mansion, the factory, the town infrastructure would all share a unified architectural vision. Urban was given instructions to create something suitable for a successful businessman, but not ostentatious. Catherine was involved in the planning. She wanted color, light, and gardens. A contract for the mansion was signed in 1905, but construction was delayed until early 1906. While the house was being built, signs of trouble appeared. In 1902, 3 years after her marriage, Catherine complained to a friend about losing control of her body. Quote 2, she said. Quote 3. The doctors called it locomotor ataxia. The precise symptoms and progression were mysterious. What was certain was that Catherine was ill with something that would only worsen. The disease affected her nervous system. She lost balance. She lost sensation to heat and cold. By 1912, she would struggle to walk. By 1914, she would be nearly paralyzed. But in 1906, when construction of High Point began, Catherine was still mobile. She was still planting gardens. She was still decorating rooms. The illness was a shadow over their future. But not yet a prison. Milton and Catherine moved into High Point in the spring of 1908. The factory had been operating since 1905. The town was growing. Houses lined new streets. A trolley system connected the town to surrounding communities. Workers who had taken jobs in a field now lived in a functioning town with a bank, a school, and a post office. In 1906, the community had been officially named Hershey. Everything bore Milton's name: the factory, the town, the products. The control was absolute. Catherine tried to carve out space for herself. She worked with the Lancaster Charity Society, an organization dedicated to helping poor families and children. She became one of 7 inaugural Life members, contributing $100 annually. The experience shaped her thinking about philanthropy. She saw poverty up close. She saw children without opportunities. She and Milton could not have children of their own. Catherine's illness made it impossible. The realization devastated them both. On the 15th of November, 1909, Milton and Catherine signed a deed of trust establishing the Hershey Industrial School for orphaned boys. The school would provide a home and education for boys between ages 4 and 8 whose fathers had died. The boys would learn trades and receive moral instruction. They would be fed plain, wholesome food and clothed plainly. They would have opportunities. When asked later why he had started the school, Milton always gave the same answer. Quote 4. The school began with 4 students in 1910. They lived at the homestead, Milton's birthplace. which had been converted into a home and classroom. Catherine worked closely with Prudence Copenhaver, the wife of the school's first superintendent, planning menus, clothing, and social training. She wanted the boys to learn etiquette and how to function in society. She hosted them for breakfast at High Point annually. She was building the family she could not have naturally. By 1906, construction of High Point Mansion had begun. The house Milton Hershey built for his wife would outlast their marriage by 110 years. She would live in it for 7. The mansion Milton and Catherine designed together was modest by the standards of American industrialists. It was also a surveillance post. Chapter 3. The mansion that watched High Point sat in a place called Imboden's Woods, on a rise above the chocolate factory. The site was chosen for elevation. From the hilltop, Milton Hershey could see everything he had created spread below him. The factory with its distinctive smokestacks, the grid of streets he had planned, the houses he had built for his workers, the stores, the bank, the schools, every building visible, every street within view. The mansion was not just a home, it was a watchtower. C. Emlyn Urban designed the structure in colonial revival style with Greek revival influences. The design was elegant but restrained. 22 rooms, 2.5 floors, locally quarried limestone exterior. The house cost $53,433, according to Urban's invoice. With furnishings and landscaping, the total reached approximately $100,000. For context, George Vanderbilt had spent $10 million on Biltmore, his 250-room mansion in Asheville, North Carolina. Hershey's house was modest, but modesty served a purpose. Hershey was not building a palace to intimidate. He was building a command post disguised as a home. The mansion's location made the message clear. Milton lived above his workers literally and figuratively. They looked up at his house on the hill. He looked down at their lives. The physical arrangement reinforced the social arrangement. Benevolence flowed downward. Gratitude was expected upward. Urban created an unusual open plan for the first floor. No doors separated the living room, dining room, library. An entry hall. The spaces flowed into each other. The entry hall was designed specifically to showcase a cut-glass torchère that Milton had purchased at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The massive light fixture dominated the circular foyer. Visitors entered and immediately understood they were in a house where details mattered. The grand staircase rose from the foyer to the second floor. A stunning stained glass window by the Rudy Glass Company of York, Pennsylvania, filtered light onto the stairs. The same company had created stained glass for the Hershey Community Building and would later create windows for the Hotel Hershey. Urban was building a cohesive aesthetic for the entire town. The mansion, while separate, was part of the larger vision. The first floor included a billiard room featuring a mural depicting scenes from _5_ by Sir Walter Scott. This was peculiar because Milton Hershey had no interest in novels. He read newspapers and business journals. He sat in his sitting room each day with a card table, several newspapers, and a cigar. He read every paper thoroughly. The billiard room with its literary mural was for guests, not for Milton. It was a space where he could entertain business associates after dinner parties. Heavy wooden paneling gave the room a masculine character. Milton's cigar humidor was stored there in a cabinet with Art Nouveau carvings. Milton and Catherine had separate bedrooms on the second floor. This was typical for wealthy couples of the era. Milton's bedroom was called the Gold Room. Catherine's bedroom had rose-pink walls and carpet. 2 guest bedrooms were called the Blue Room and the Green Room. Catherine insisted on color throughout the house. She wanted rooms that felt alive. Milton preferred heavy, ornate Victorian furniture in dark wood. Catherine preferred lighter, more modern pieces with soft colors and floral patterns. The house reflected both of their tastes, though Catherine's influence was stronger in the decorating choices. An octagonal breakfast room on the first floor offered views of the grounds. The dining room featured a hidden button under the table that Catherine could press to summon staff without speaking. It was a small luxury, but one she appreciated as her illness progressed and speaking became difficult. The dining room table and cabinets were original to the house. The Hersheys did entertain, though not as extensively as other industrialists. The grounds were landscaped by Oglesby Paul, a Philadelphia landscape architect, with later expansions overseen by Harry A. Haverstick. The design emphasized understated elegance. Open lawns framed the mansion. Wooded areas to the east provided privacy. The landscaping preserved panoramic views of Hershey while creating seclusion. Catherine loved gardens. She supervised the planting of flowers around a bordered pool with a fountain. Later, a statue called quote _6 was added. The gardens were Catherine's domain. The staff at High Point was remarkably small for a house of this scale: a housekeeper, a houseman, and a housemaid, sometimes a chauffeur. The housekeeper was Bertha Candoni, who had first met the Hersheys during their travels in Europe. She spoke 7 languages and managed Catherine's wardrobe. The houseman was Clayton Lehman, who had previously worked as a gardener at the homestead. He maintained the house, supervised repairs, and tried to keep peace between Mrs. Candoni and the housemaids. The housemaids changed 22 times in 11 years. This suggests either impossible standards or dysfunction that made the position unbearable. From every window on the north side of High Point, Milton could see his factory. He could watch workers entering and leaving. He could observe the shift changes. He could see the trolleys bringing employees from surrounding towns. He could see the houses he had built, the streets he had named, the bank he owned, the stores he controlled. The mansion's position was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice to maintain visual supervision. The factory operated around the clock during busy periods. At night, lights blazed from the windows. Steam rose from the smokestacks. From his bedroom window, Milton could watch production continue while he slept, or tried to sleep. He was known to work long hours and sleep little. The factory was always on his mind. The mansion allowed him to never escape it, even when he was home. Catherine had a different relationship with the view. She could not see the factory from her rose-pink bedroom on the opposite side of the house. Her windows faced the gardens and the woods beyond. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is unclear, but the effect was that Catherine lived in a different world from Milton, even though they shared a house. He watched the factory. She watched flowers bloom. The mansion was completed in 1908. Milton was 51 years old. Catherine was 36. They had been married 10 years. Catherine's illness had been progressing for 6 years. They moved into a house built for entertaining and family life, knowing that Catherine's condition would only worsen. The mansion was designed for a future that would never arrive. For 7 years, the mansion was a home. Then it became a hospital, then a tomb for the living. Chapter 4. The Disease That Killed. Slowly, Catherine Hershey could no longer walk without help by 1912. She was 40 years old. The locomotor ataxia that had begun 10 years earlier had progressed from occasional loss of balance to near-complete paralysis. She could not sense heat or cold. She could not control her limbs reliably. She structured her life to avoid embarrassing friends in public. A contemporary, Miss Laura Ezra Hershey, remembered, "She suffered from a kind of creeping paralysis, but she was very plucky and never made you feel uncomfortable about it." The mansion became Catherine's world. She could no longer travel extensively. She could no longer host large gatherings. She spent increasing amounts of time in her rose-pink bedroom or in the gardens when weather permitted. Milton brought her roses daily. He had a memorial rose garden planted approximately 400 feet east of the mansion, edged with boxwood and peonies. An arch with climbing American beauty roses marked the entrance to the woods beyond. The roses were for Catherine. Everything was for Catherine. Between 1911 and 1913, the Hersheys took an extended trip to Europe lasting a year and a half. Catherine could still walk during this period, but she had trouble keeping her balance and always held onto a companion's arm. They consulted specialists in multiple countries. None could halt the disease's progression. They visited spas seeking relief. Nothing worked. The trip was Catherine's last extended period of mobility. When they returned to Hershey, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors eventually gave up. There was no treatment, no cure, no hope. Catherine turned to Christian Science as a source of comfort. Members of this belief system believed that evil and physical illness could be overcome through prayer and deeper understanding of God. Whether Catherine truly believed this or simply needed something to cling to is unknowable. Milton supported whatever brought her peace. Despite her declining health, Catherine remained involved with the Hershey Industrial School. The school had grown from 4 boys in 1910 to 60 boys by 1915. Catherine worked with Prudence Copenhaver to plan the Home Life program. They discussed menus, clothing, social skills, and what the boys should learn beyond academics. Catherine hosted the boys for breakfast at High Point each year. As her condition worsened and public appearances became difficult, these breakfasts meant everything to her. She could not have her own children, but she could mother these boys temporarily. Milton watched his wife disappear slowly. The vibrant woman who had brought color and laughter to his austere life was fading. He could not save her with his money. He could not control the disease with his willpower. He could build a town, command thousands of workers, and generate millions of dollars in revenue, but he could not stop Catherine from dying. The limitation enraged and devastated him. In March 1915, Catherine was in Atlantic City seeking relief from sea air. Milton was called away on business. Catherine decided to return to Hershey. She had a new nurse drive her in a convertible. The numbness in her limbs made her oblivious to temperature. She insisted on riding with the top down despite the cold, raw day. The March air was brutal. With every mile, Catherine's condition worsened. They had to stop at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. Catherine had developed pneumonia. Milton was contacted. He hurried to Philadelphia, arriving Thursday afternoon, the 25th of March, 1915. Catherine greeted him and asked for a glass of champagne. Milton went personally to procure it. When he returned with the champagne, Catherine was dead. She had known she was dying. She had sent him away so he would not witness the moment. Milton Hershey was like a madman, according to the nurse present. His wife had died alone while he fetched champagne. She had orchestrated her death to spare him the trauma of watching. He would carry the guilt for 30 years. Catherine's body was placed in a receiving vault at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Milton could not bear to bury her. The body remained in the vault for 4 years. Milton had flowers placed on the casket twice weekly. He visited regularly. He could not let go. The funeral on the 27th of March was held in the chapel adjoining the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Philadelphia. Thousands attended. Milton gave his employees the day off and provided free train tickets so they could attend. Catherine Sweeney Hershey was 42 or 43 years old, depending on which birth year is correct. She had been married to Milton for 17 years. She had lived at High Point for 7 years. She had never complained publicly about her illness. She had maintained her cheerfulness and grace until the end. And she had died alone because she loved her husband too much to let him watch. In 1919, 4 years after her death, Milton finally moved Catherine's body from Philadelphia to the newly established Hershey Cemetery. Her grave marker had to be shortened by 3/4 of an inch due to damage during preparation. The shortened stone became a symbol. Catherine's life had been cut short by disease. Her grave marker was cut short by accident. Even in death, she was diminished. Milton was 57 years old. He had built the tallest chocolate factory in Pennsylvania, a town of thousands, a fortune worth millions. He had given much of it away to orphans who would never know his wife's name. And he was alone in a house built for 2, surrounded by empty rooms and roses that would not bloom until spring. 3 years after Catherine's death, Milton Hershey gave away his fortune. He did not announce it. He told no one. For 5 years, he kept it secret. Chapter 5. The Fortune He Gave Away. On the 13th of November, 1918, Milton Hershey transferred his entire fortune to a trust for orphaned boys. He told no one. The transaction was conducted quietly with his lawyers and the trustees of the Hershey Industrial School. No press release was issued. No announcement was made. Milton signed the documents, transferred ownership of all his Hershey Chocolate Company stock to the school trust, and went back to work as if nothing had changed. The stock was worth approximately $60 million. For context, Coca-Cola had sold for $25 million that same year. Milton's gift was larger than the value of one of America's most successful beverage companies. The gift included not just the chocolate factory, but all of Milton's enterprises. the Hershey Improvement Company, which owned and operated the town's infrastructure, the utilities, water, sewer, electric, telephone, the Hershey Transit Company, which ran the trolleys, the Hershey department store, the greenhouse and nursery. Even Milton's Cuban holdings, sugar plantations he had acquired to ensure steady supplies for chocolate production. Everything went into the trust. The deed specified that the trust's sole purpose was to benefit the Hershey Industrial School. The school would educate orphaned boys from poor families. It would provide them with a home, an education, and vocational training. The boys would learn farming, animal husbandry, and trades. They would leave the school prepared to earn a living and support families. Milton had given away his fortune to create opportunities for boys who started with nothing, just as he had. But Milton kept the gift secret for 5 years. He continued living at High Point. He continued running the chocolate company. He attended board meetings, made business decisions, and maintained complete operational control. The only difference was that he no longer owned anything. The orphans owned it. The trust controlled it. Milton merely operated it. Several factors motivated the gift. Catherine's death in 1915 left Milton without heirs. His mother Fanny had died, his father Henry was estranged, and he had no siblings who mattered to him. The fortune would have gone to distant relatives or been contested in probate. Milton decided to give it away while alive so he could ensure it served a purpose he and Catherine had chosen together. World War I had also affected Milton's thinking. The war demonstrated how quickly fortunes could vanish. Businesses could be destroyed. Wealth could evaporate. By placing his fortune in a trust with a defined charitable purpose, Milton protected it from uncertainty. The trust would endure regardless of what happened to him or the company. There was also a sugar crisis during the war. The U.S. government controlled sugar distribution, and chocolate manufacturers struggled to obtain enough supply. Milton had learned during the war how vulnerable his business was to external forces. By giving control to a trust, he created an entity that could outlast any individual crisis. But the deepest motivation was Catherine. The school had been her idea. She had worked to establish it and shape its early years. After her death, Milton poured himself into expanding the school as a memorial to his wife. By giving his fortune to the school, he ensured that Catherine's legacy would endure. The orphan boys were the children they never had. The school was the family they never built. Milton lived alone at High Point from 1915 to 1930. 15 years in a 22-room mansion built for a couple. He traveled extensively because he could not bear to stay in the house for long, but he always came back. High Point was where Catherine had lived. Her rose-pink bedroom remained unchanged. Her gardens were maintained. Milton walked to her portrait each night before bed and kissed it. The housekeepers witnessed this ritual for years. An old man in an empty mansion, kissing a painting, unable to let go. The Hershey Industrial School grew during this period. 60 boys in 1915, 100 boys by the early 1920s, over 300 by 1931. The school occupied thousands of acres of farmland around Hershey. Boys lived in cottages with house parents. They attended classes, worked on farms, and learned trades. The school was becoming exactly what Milton and Catherine had envisioned. In 1923, 5 years after the gift, a journalist named James C. Young discovered the transaction and published an article in the New York Times. The headline read, Quote 8. The story created a sensation. Milton was forced to explain why he had kept the gift secret for 5 years. He told reporters he did not want competitors saying he was using orphans to sell more chocolate. If people knew the chocolate company's profits supported orphaned boys, competitors could claim Hershey was taking advantage of sympathy to increase sales. Milton wanted the gift to be pure, not a marketing scheme, not a public relations strategy. Just a transfer of wealth from a man with no heirs to boys with no parents. I am 66 years old and do not need much money, Milton said. I have no heirs, so I have decided to make the orphan boys of the United States my heirs. The quote appeared in newspapers across the country. Milton Hershey became famous not for building a chocolate empire, but for giving it away. Yet Milton retained complete control. He was still president of the Hershey Chocolate Company, even though he owned no stock. He still lived at High Point, even though he was increasingly alone there. He still oversaw every aspect of the town, even though the trust technically owned most of it. He had surrendered ownership, but not power. The distinction would matter. By 1930, Milton could no longer bear living alone at High Point. The house was too large, too empty, too full of Catherine's absence. He donated the mansion to the newly formed Hershey Country Club. The first floor would be converted to club facilities. A golf course would be built on the grounds. Members could enjoy the house that Milton and Catherine had built. But Milton could not leave entirely. He retained a modest apartment on the second floor. 2 rooms where he could watch his factory, his town, his legacy. He was 73 years old. The Great Depression was beginning. And in 7 years, from that second-floor window, he would watch everything he had built turn against him. Between 1930 and 1937, Milton Hershey tried to save his town from the Depression. The workers would remember his paternalism. They would not remember it kindly. Chapter 6. The Campaign That Proved Control. On the 24th of October, 1929. The stock market began to collapse. Black Thursday. Panic selling overwhelmed the exchanges. By the 29th, Black Tuesday, billions of dollars in paper wealth had vanished. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment began climbing toward 25%. The economic assumptions that had made America prosperous for a decade were revealed as speculation and illusion. The Depression had begun. In Hershey, Pennsylvania, workers asked, Quote 11. Milton Hershey responded to the economic collapse by building. While other industrialists laid off workers and shuttered factories, Hershey launched the Great Building Campaign. Between 1930 and 1939, over 600 men found employment constructing buildings that would become tourist attractions and community landmarks. The Hotel Hershey, a Mediterranean-style luxury hotel inspired by hotels Milton had seen during his travels. The Hershey Community Theater, an ornate performance space. The Hershey Sports Arena, a new stadium. A junior-senior high school building that later became Catherine Hall. The building campaign served multiple purposes. It kept workers employed during the Depression. It beautified the town. It created infrastructure that would attract tourists and generate revenue for decades. And it reinforced Milton Hershey's control over every aspect of his town. He decided what would be built, where it would be built, and who would build it. His paternalism was both generous and suffocating. Workers were grateful for employment. A job during the Depression was precious. Many communities collapsed as factories closed and workers scattered. Hershey remained stable. The chocolate factory continued operating. The building campaign provided additional work. Families could afford food, housing, medical care. Compared to the rest of America, Hershey was paradise. But the paradise had rules. Workers lived in houses Hershey owned or controlled. They shopped at stores Hershey operated. They used utilities Hershey provided. They rode trolleys Hershey ran. Their children attended schools Hershey funded. Every aspect of daily life was owned, managed, or overseen by one man and his executives. If a worker was fired, he could lose not just his job but his housing, his access to services, and his place in the community. The control was total. Hiring and firing decisions were often based on personal relationships and favoritism rather than merit or seniority. Workers who were friendly with managers kept their jobs. Workers who complained or challenged decisions were let go. The system rewarded loyalty and punished independence. Some workers appreciated the security. Others resented the lack of autonomy. The Depression made the control worse. The National Recovery Administration, a federal agency created to stabilize the economy, mandated that wages and hours be regulated. Hershey complied by cutting hours from 60 per week to 40. This reduced paychecks significantly. Workers who had been earning enough to support families on 60 hours suddenly could not afford basics on 40 hours. The wage cuts were technically required by federal law. But workers blamed Hershey for not finding ways to compensate them. By the mid-1930s, resentment was building beneath the surface of the model town. Workers appreciated having jobs. They appreciated the housing and amenities, but they were tired of everything being controlled by one man. They wanted higher wages. They wanted job security based on contracts, not personal relationships. They wanted the right to organize without fear of losing everything. In late 1936, a newsletter called The Chocolate Bar Bee began circulating through the chocolate factory. The leaflet aired grievances about low wages, erratic work schedules, and orders to speed up production. It described working conditions as physically demanding, with deafening noise levels and temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. It criticized Milton Hershey and William Murray, the company president, for their high salaries and slave-driving methods. The newsletter was signed by the Communist Party of Hershey, Pennsylvania. Whether an actual Communist Party cell existed in Hershey is unclear. The newsletter's rhetoric was communist in style, but it may have been written by labor organizers using communist language to provoke a response. Regardless of its origins, the newsletter circulated widely. Workers read it, they discussed it, and some began thinking about unionization. In January 1937, members of the Congress of Industrial Organizations held a secret meeting at a firehouse in Palmyra, Pennsylvania, a town near Hershey. Several hundred Hershey employees attended. By the end of the meeting, they had formed a local chapter of the United Chocolate Workers Union. Within weeks, several hundred factory workers had joined. The union movement had come to Hershey. When the union first approached Hershey management to negotiate, they were met with limited resistance. The corporation agreed to raise wages to 60 cents per hour for men and 45 cents per hour for women. This was the initial agreement in March 1937. But after the agreement, Hershey laid off some union organizers as part of what company President William Murray claimed were seasonal cutbacks. The union argued that Hershey was violating the promise of job security for organizers that had been part of the March agreement. The union was only weeks old. It was fragile. The leadership was inexperienced, and the layoffs threatened to destroy the union before it could establish itself. The workers made a decision. They would strike, and they would do it using the tactic that had succeeded recently at General Motors. They would sit down inside the factory and refuse to leave until their demands were met. Milton Hershey was 79 years old. He lived in his second-floor apartment at High Point Mansion, which he no longer owned. He watched his town every day from his window. He did not understand what was happening. He had given his workers houses, schools, parks, and jobs during the Depression. He had built a model community based on benevolence and care, and now they were organizing against him. By early 1937, hundreds of Hershey workers had joined the United Chocolate Workers Union. They met in secret. They made demands. On the 2nd of April, 1937, they would occupy Milton Hershey's factory, and from his second-floor apartment at High Point, Milton Hershey would watch. The sit-down strike began on a Thursday morning. It would last 6 days. It would end in blood. Chapter 7. The Strike Milton. Watched on the 2nd of April, 1937, workers occupied the Hershey Chocolate Factory. Some sat down at their posts. Others went outside to picket. Hundreds took to the roofs of factory buildings along Chocolate Avenue. The exact number of strikers is disputed. Union organizers claim 1,200. Hershey executives claim 400. The truth was likely somewhere between. The strikers organized in shifts. Food was supplied by a union kitchen. Surveillance cameras were installed to ensure company property was not damaged. Smoking was banned in sanitary areas of the factory. The Congress of Industrial Organizations flag flew above the factory, replacing the American flag. For the first few days, the atmosphere was almost festive. Strikers smiled for newspaper photographers. They were optimistic that negotiations would resolve the dispute quickly. Some described the sit-down as more like a family squabble than an angry revolution. But this was not a family. Milton Hershey had believed his workers were family. They had believed he was a benevolent father. The strike revealed that neither belief was true. This was a business relationship, and the workers wanted to renegotiate the terms. William Murray, the company president, was strongly anti-union. Unlike Milton, who was old and increasingly detached from daily operations, Murray was actively hostile to the union's demands. He refused to negotiate in good faith. He waited. He knew the sit-down could not last indefinitely. The strikers would eventually need to leave, and when they did, he would fire them. By the 5th day, milk was spoiling. The Hershey factory used approximately 240,000 quarts of milk per day from local dairy farmers. With the factory occupied and production stopped, the milk sat in tanks on the factory floor. The smell became unbearable, nearly 250,000 quarts rotting in the heat. The financial loss was staggering for both Hershey and the farmers who supplied the dairy. The farmers were furious. They depended on Hershey to buy their milk. They had contracts. They had invested in dairy operations based on guaranteed sales to the chocolate factory. Now their milk was spoiling, and they were losing money because factory workers were sitting down instead of working. The farmers blamed the strikers, not Hershey management. In town, opinion split between unionists and those loyal to Hershey. Crowds of anti-strike protesters gathered at rallies. Many were farmers whose livelihoods depended on the factory. Others were Hershey employees who had not joined the strike and resented being portrayed as victims who needed a union to protect them. They believed Milton Hershey had treated them fairly. They saw the strike as betrayal. On the 7th of April, the 6th day of the strike, chaos erupted. Thousands of farmers, joined by loyal Hershey employees, stormed the factory. They came armed with fists, shoes, clubs, and ice picks. They broke through the picket lines. They entered the factory. They found the strikers and beat them. The violence was systematic and brutal. Strikers were dragged from their posts and assaulted. Some were thrown downstairs. Others were beaten with makeshift weapons. Ice picks were jabbed into flesh. Shoes were used to kick fallen men. The assault lasted minutes, but felt longer to those being beaten. Guards could not stop it. Police arrived too late to prevent it. The mob worked quickly and then dispersed to tend to their fields and cows. The New York Times described the event as a spontaneous action by angry farmers who administered, quote, 15, the language minimized the violence. But for the strikers, it was not a walloping. It was a coordinated attack by a mob that outnumbered them and wanted to send a message. Challenge Milton Hershey, and you will pay. Milton Hershey watched from his second-floor apartment at High Point. He could see the factory. He could see crowds gathering. He could see the violence unfold. He was 80 years old. He had built this town to avoid the labor strife that plagued other industrial communities. He had provided everything his workers could need, and now they were being beaten in his factory by farmers defending his interests. Later, people claimed Milton had orchestrated the mob. Workers blamed him for the violence. They believed he had encouraged the farmers to attack. Whether this was true is unknowable. Milton never publicly commented on the strike in detail. He was, quote, 16, according to those close to him. He felt betrayed. He could not understand why his workers had rebelled. The strike ended on the 7th of April. The factory was cleared. The strikers were gone. But the damage was permanent. The union movement in Hershey did not die. Legal battles followed. In 1940, the factory was unionized through the American Federation of Labor. John Shearer became the first president of local chapter number 464 of the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers International Union. The workers had won, not immediately, not without violence, but they had won. On the 28th of February, 1939, less than 2 years after the Hershey Strike, the United States Supreme Court declared sit-down strikes illegal. The tactic that had succeeded at General Motors and nearly succeeded at Hershey was now prohibited. Workers could strike, but they could not occupy factories. The Hershey Strike had contributed to the legal decision that banned the method it employed. Milton Hershey never understood why his workers had betrayed him. He was 80 years old. He had 8 years left to live. He would spend them alone in his second-floor apartment, watching a world that no longer made sense. The strike lasted 6 days. It ended in blood and broken bones. The factory was unionized within 3 years. Milton Hershey had given his workers houses, schools, parks, jobs during the Depression. They had repaid him with rebellion. He was 80 years old. He would live 8 more years in his second-floor apartment. He would never understand why they had betrayed him. Milton Hershey never understood why his workers had betrayed him. He was 80 years old. He would live 8 more years in his second-floor apartment, watching a world that no longer made sense. Chapter 8. The War That Filled the Mansion. Milton Hershey never recovered from the 1937 strike. The rebellion had broken something in him that could not be repaired. He continued attending to company business. He remained involved with the school, but the energy was gone. The certainty was gone. He had believed his paternalism was benevolence. His workers had called it control. Both were correct. The contradiction haunted his final years. In 1940, 3 years after the strike, the Hershey chocolate factory was officially unionized. The Bakery and Confectionery Workers International Union, affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, successfully organized the workers. John Shearer became the first president of the local chapter. Contracts were negotiated. Wages and working conditions were formalized. The personal relationships and favoritism that had characterized hiring and firing were replaced by union rules and grievance procedures. The workers had what they wanted. Milton had lost control. He retreated further into his second-floor apartment at High Point. The mansion he had donated to the country club in 1930 remained nominally his residence. He kept 2 rooms on the second floor, a bedroom and a sitting room. From the windows, he could still see the factory. He could still watch the town, but he no longer controlled what he saw. The factory operated according to union contracts. The town functioned according to its own rhythms. Milton Hershey was becoming irrelevant to his own creation. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. The Hershey chocolate factory shifted to wartime production. The company developed Ration D bars, chocolate bars designed for military use. The bars had to weigh 1 or 2 ounces. They had to resist melting at temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And they had to taste just good enough that soldiers would eat them, but not so good that soldiers would develop cravings and consume their emergency rations unnecessarily. Hershey succeeded in creating a barely palatable, highly durable chocolate bar that the U.S. Army ordered by the millions. The factory operated at capacity throughout the war. Workers who had struck in 1937 now worked overtime to supply troops overseas. The irony was not lost on anyone. The union that Milton had resisted was now essential to the war effort. The workers he had viewed as disloyal were now supporting the military. The factory that had been occupied and shut down was now running constantly to feed soldiers. High Point Mansion found new purpose during the war. The federal government leased multiple floors for war-related offices. Military procurement agencies moved in. Intelligence services took space. The Office of Price Administration, which managed rationing and price controls, occupied several floors. For the first time since 1908, when Milton and Catherine had moved in, the mansion was full. Government employees worked where Catherine had entertained guests. Desks filled the living room, where Milton had read newspapers by the fireplace. Filing cabinets lined the entry hall where the cut-glass torchère had once dominated. The octagonal breakfast room where Catherine had looked out at her gardens was now a conference room for discussing sugar rations and supply chain logistics. The transformation was complete. Catherine's home had become a bureaucratic office building. Security became paramount. Guards checked identification at the entrance. Access to certain floors was restricted based on clearance levels. The observation deck's view, which had allowed Milton to survey his town, now raised concerns about espionage. The tallest point in Hershey was also the most visible. Enemy agents could theoretically use it to observe military-related activity at the factory. The concerns were likely overblown, but precautions were taken. Milton watched strangers fill his wife's house. He heard their footsteps in the hallways. He saw them entering rooms where Catherine had slept, dressed, and lived. They had no idea who Catherine was. They had no reason to care. High Point was just an office building to them, a convenient location requisitioned by the government for the war effort. Milton lived on the second floor surrounded by people who did not know him and did not particularly care that he was there. By 1945, Milton Hershey was 88 years old. His health was declining. He had outlived his wife by 30 years. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had outlived his relevance. The chocolate company he founded was thriving without him. The town he built was functioning without his oversight. The school he endowed was educating hundreds of boys who would never meet him. Everything he had created had moved beyond him. On the 13th of October, 1945, Milton Hershey died in his second-floor apartment at High Point Mansion. He died as he had lived his last 30 years, alone. His body was removed from the mansion and taken to Hershey Cemetery. He was buried next to Catherine. The grave marker listed his birth date, September 13th, 1857, and his death date, October 13th, 1945. 88 years. 30 of them without the woman he loved. Milton left a personal estate valued at $900,000. Everything else, the chocolate company, the town infrastructure, the school, had been given away in 1918. The $60 million he had transferred to the school trust was now worth considerably more. The chocolate company had grown during the war. The trust's assets had multiplied. The fortune Milton had given away was generating wealth he would never see. The federal government continued occupying High Point after Milton's death. The war in Europe had ended in May. The war in the Pacific had ended in August. But the government's presence at High Point extended into 1946 as agencies transitioned back to peacetime operations. Eventually, the government departed. The mansion returned to the country club. The first floor resumed serving as club facilities. The second floor, where Milton had lived and died, was converted to additional club space. With Milton Hershey gone, the question became, what to do with his mansion? Chapter 9. The mansion nobody wanted. For 25 years after Milton's death, High Point Mansion served as the Hershey Country Club's clubhouse. The first floor housed club facilities, a dining room, a lounge, administrative offices. The second floor, where Milton had lived, was converted to member amenities. The billiard room with its Ivanhoe mural became exactly what it had always been, a space for wealthy men to smoke cigars and play billiards. But now they were country club members, not Milton's business associates. The mansion aged, paint peeled, wood trim required maintenance. The limestone exterior needed periodic cleaning. The mechanical systems, installed in 1906, required updates. The country club performed necessary repairs but did not invest in major renovations. High Point was functional but not exceptional. It served its purpose. Nothing more. In the 1960s, the Hershey Chocolate Company faced a crisis. Forrest Mars, the founder's son who had taken control of Mars Incorporated, launched an aggressive campaign to steal market share from Hershey. Mars had been a client of Hershey, purchasing bulk chocolate to make candy bars like Snickers and Milky Way. But Forrest Mars terminated the partnership and ordered his engineers to learn how to make Hershey-caliber chocolate in 6 months. He modernized his factories. He increased advertising. He attacked Hershey's dominance systematically. By the end of the decade, Mars had caught Hershey in market share. The chocolate colossus was in crisis. The company that had never needed to advertise because it had no real competition now faced an aggressive rival with superior marketing and modern operations. Hershey had to respond. The response was painful. Hershey terminated the free services and amenities that had been core to Milton's vision. No more free snow removal. No more subsidized utilities. No more comprehensive employee benefits beyond what was legally required or negotiated through union contracts. The era of paternalism was over. Residents protested. It was a very traumatic time for the community, one executive recalled. The company was liquidating assets and cutting costs to compete with Mars. Milton's model town was being dismantled. The country club also struggled. By 1970, the club needed a new facility. High Point was too small, too old, and too expensive to maintain. The club built a modern facility on Dairy Road and moved operations there. High Point was no longer needed. For 7 years, from 1970 to 1977, High Point Mansion sat largely vacant. The country club had abandoned it. The community did not know what to do with it. The mansion required expensive maintenance. It was too large for a single family. It was too historically significant to demolish, but no one wanted to take responsibility for it. The building deteriorated. Weather damaged the exterior. The interior collected dust. Pipes froze in winter. The landscaping grew wild. High Point, which had once overlooked a thriving town with pride, now sat empty and decaying. The mansion that had housed Milton and Catherine, then a country club, then federal offices, then a country club again, now housed nothing. It was an abandoned monument to a forgotten vision. In 1977, the Hershey Foods Corporation purchased High Point for use as corporate headquarters. The decision was controversial. The mansion needed extensive renovations. Converting a gracious home into functional office space would be expensive and challenging. But Bill Dearden, CEO of Hershey Foods Corporation, insisted. Quote 19, he said in an oral history interview. Hershey Foods allocated $2 million for renovations. The project presented significant challenges. Many of the porches had deteriorated beyond repair and were too expensive to restore. They were removed. The attic was converted to office space. The first floor was largely preserved to maintain the architectural integrity of the house. Milton's sitting room remained recognizable. The dining room with Catherine's hidden button under the table was protected. The entry hall where the cut-glass torchiere had stood was maintained. But the house was no longer a home. It was an office building. Hershey Foods used High Point as corporate headquarters from 1977 to 1991. Executives worked in Milton's former bedroom. Staff meetings were held in Catherine's rose-pink bedroom. The billiard room became a conference space. The mansion functioned efficiently as office space. But the transformation was jarring. Every room that had held personal memories was now filled with desks, computers, and filing cabinets. In 1983, High Point Mansion was designated a National Historic Landmark. The designation recognized the mansion's significance to American industrial history. Milton Hershey had been one of the most successful businessmen of the early 20th century. His model town and philanthropic legacy were historically important. The mansion where he had lived and died deserved protection. The National Historic Landmark status brought restrictions. The exterior could not be significantly altered without approval. Any major renovations required oversight from preservation authorities. The building had become history. It could not be changed without permission. In 1991, Hershey Foods Corporation relocated to a new corporate headquarters just north of Hershey. High Point was no longer suitable for their needs. The Hershey Trust Company moved into the mansion in December 1991. The trust was the logical occupant. It managed the school trust that controlled the chocolate company and other Hershey assets. It oversaw the philanthropic legacy Milton had created. Having the trust's offices in Milton's former home created symbolic continuity. The Hershey Trust Company has occupied High Point since 1991. The mansion now houses the offices that manage the $17.4 billion endowment Milton created when he gave away $60 million in 1918. The building serves the entity that controls Hershey's fortune, Hershey's company, and Hershey's legacy. The mansion that Milton built, gave away, and died in now administers the wealth he surrendered. The Hershey Trust Company has occupied High Point since 1991. The mansion now houses the offices that manage the $17.4 billion endowment Milton created when he gave away $60 million in 1918. The building serves the entity that controls Hershey's fortune, Hershey's company, and Hershey's legacy. The mansion that Milton built, gave away, and died in now administers the wealth he surrendered. But that wealth has become controversial. Chapter 10. The Wealth That Kept Growing. In 1963, the Hershey Trust faced a problem Milton Hershey had not anticipated. The chocolate company he had given away in 1918 was generating more profit than the Milton Hershey School could spend. The $60 million Milton had transferred to the school trust had grown through 45 years of chocolate sales, stock dividends, and compound interest. By the early 1960s, the trust controlled assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The school educated several hundred boys. The math did not work. Samuel Hinkle, president of Hershey Chocolate Corporation and a director on the trust company board, began worrying about the accumulation in 1959. He wrote to the board expressing concern that the trust's wealth was growing faster than the number of qualified orphans was declining. Medical advances meant parents were living longer. Social safety nets meant fewer true orphans. The original deed of trust, signed in 1909, specified that the school would serve orphaned boys whose fathers had died. By the 1960s, there were simply not enough boys who met that criteria to absorb the trust's income. Hinkle asked the board, "I began to wonder what Mr. Hershey would do if he himself were living with the accumulation of money that he didn't need for his orphans. What would he do?" The answer Hinkle proposed was to loosen the admission requirements. The The deed of trust allowed for admitting boys from broken homes who were not technically orphans. By admitting boys from single-parent households or from families too poor to care for them, the school could grow. But Hinkle also understood that dramatically expanding the school would invite criticism. The trust was already controversial. Spending too little while accumulating too much would make the controversy worse. Hinkle proposed an alternative solution. Transfer $50 million from the trust to the M.S. Hershey Foundation, a separate entity. Use that money to fund a project that aligned with Milton's charitable intentions, but was not technically part of the school. Specifically, Hinkle proposed building a medical school and teaching hospital. The hospital would serve central Pennsylvania. It would train doctors, it would conduct research, and it would honor Milton Hershey's legacy of using wealth to benefit others. The Dauphin County Orphans Court approved the transfer in August 1963. To comply with the deed of trust restrictions, the transfer went through the M.S. Hershey Foundation rather than directly from the school trust. The foundation then partnered with Pennsylvania State University to construct what became the Penn State Milton S. Hershey Medical Center. Ground was broken on the 26th of February 1966. The medical center was completed in 1970. The facility included a medical school, a teaching hospital, and research facilities. It became one of Pennsylvania's leading medical institutions. The $50 million gift solved the immediate problem of excess wealth, but it did not solve the underlying issue. The chocolate company continued generating enormous profits. The trust's assets continued growing. By the 1970s, the trust was again accumulating wealth faster than the school could spend it. The school began admitting African American students in 1970 after a Supreme Court decision required the racial desegregation of similar institutions. In 1976, the school petitioned the Dauphin County Court to allow girls. The first 8 girls arrived in March 1977. By 1978, female students made up 10% of enrollment. The school also loosened its definition of orphan to include children from single-parent households and what were called social orphans, children whose parents could not afford to care for them. By the 1980s and 90s, the school was admitting any qualified low-income child between ages 4 and 15 who did not have severe intellectual or behavioral problems. Despite expanding admissions, the school's enrollment remained around 2,000 students. This was largely by choice. The school maintained strict admission standards. It required students to live on campus in group homes. It provided comprehensive education, housing, food, medical care, and extracurricular activities at no cost to families. The cost per student was extraordinarily high, but the school could afford it. The trust's assets continued multiplying. By 2021, the Milton Hershey School Trust controlled assets valued at $17.4 billion. Approximately half came from the trust's controlling share of Hershey Company stock. The remainder came from investments, real estate, and other holdings. The trust also owned 100% of Hershey Entertainment and Resorts Company, which operates the Hotel Hershey, Hershey Park, and other properties. The school spends approximately 1.5% of the endowment annually. With $17.4 billion in assets, spending 1.5% equals $261 million per year. With 2,000 students, that translates to $130,500 per student per year. The school claims actual spending is $118,400 per student. But the calculation methods are disputed. The spending rate has become controversial. Most university endowments spend 4 to 6% annually. The Milton Hershey School Trust spends 1.5%. Critics argue the trust is hoarding wealth rather than using it for charitable purposes. MIT professor John Corr called the spending rate. Georgetown University law professor Brian Galley said it was Galley argued the trust school officials counter, that they must adhere to the spending limits Milton established in the original deed of trust. The deed specified that the school should operate conservatively and maintain assets in perpetuity. Dramatically increasing spending or enrollment would violate Milton's intentions. The argument has legal merit. The deed's restrictions are legally binding, but critics argue the restrictions are being used as an excuse. If the trust genuinely wanted to serve more children, it could petition the courts to modify the deed's restrictions based on changed circumstances. Courts have approved such modifications for other charitable trusts. The wealth has created other controversies. In 2002, the Hershey Trust announced plans to sell the Hershey Company for $12.5 billion dollars to diversify its holdings. The community erupted in protest. Pennsylvania's Attorney General intervened. The sale was blocked. The trust retained control of the chocolate company, but the incident revealed tensions between the trust's fiduciary duty to maximize returns and the community's emotional attachment to the Hershey Company remaining locally controlled. The trust's wealth and power extend far beyond the school. It controls the Hershey Company, which generates billions in annual revenue. It owns Hershey Entertainment and Resorts, a major regional employer. It influences community development through its real estate holdings. The entity Milton created in 1909 to educate orphaned boys has become a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that shapes the entire region's economy. Milton Hershey gave away $60 million in 1918 because he had no heirs. The fortune multiplied by 290 times. It now controls $17.4 billion and educates 2,000 children per year at a cost of $118,400 each. It could educate 132,000 children annually at the same cost. It chooses not to. The deed Milton signed prevents it, or perhaps the deed provides an excuse. Either way, Milton Hershey's gift has become as controversial as his paternalism. Today, tourists can visit High Point on Saturday mornings, if they can get tickets. Chapter 11. What we choose to remember. Tours of High Point Mansion are administered by the Hershey Story Museum. They occur on Saturdays only. The tickets are released on the 15th of each month for the following month. They sell out in 1 or 2 days. The tours last 60 to 75 minutes, 10 to 12 people maximum plus 2 tour guides. The cost is $15 to $18 per person with discounts for children, seniors, and military. Photography inside the mansion is prohibited. Visitors must stand and walk throughout the tour. No seating is available. The tour emphasizes architecture, Catherine's love story, and Milton's philanthropy. Guides describe the colonial revival and Greek revival styles. They point out the ruby stained glass window on the grand staircase. They explain how the octagonal breakfast room was designed for intimate morning meals. They show the dining room where Catherine's hidden button under the table could summon staff. They describe Milton reading newspapers with a cigar in his sitting room. They tell stories about Catherine's rose-pink bedroom and her love of gardens. What the tour does not emphasize is control. The guides do not explain that the mansion's hilltop location allowed Milton to surveil his workers. They do not discuss the 1937 strike or the violence that ended it. They do not mention that Milton watched the strike from his second-floor apartment while farmers beat his workers with ice picks. They do not address the paternalism that made workers feel grateful and trapped simultaneously. The tour does not mention that housemaids quit 22 times in 11 years. It does not discuss why the staff turnover was so high or what that suggests about working conditions in the mansion. The tour does not dwell on Catherine's disease or the 15 years Milton lived alone after her death. It does not emphasize the loneliness or the isolation. The tour presents High Point as a gracious home where a successful couple lived comfortably. The darker realities are softened or omitted. The Hershey Story Museum, which administers the tours, also operates a permanent exhibition about Milton Hershey's life. The exhibition covers his business failures, his breakthrough with caramels, his success with chocolate, and his philanthropy. The exhibition describes the founding of the school and the 1918 gift. It mentions the strike briefly, but does not detail the violence. The exhibition presents Milton as a flawed but ultimately benevolent figure who used his wealth to help others. The controversies around the school trust's current wealth and spending are not prominently featured. This selective commemoration is not unique to Hershey. Most historical sites emphasize positive narratives. Museums celebrate achievement, tours highlight beauty. The complications and costs are acknowledged but not centered. Visitors want to admire, not confront. They want to feel inspired, not troubled. The Hershey tours deliver what visitors expect, but the omissions matter. Milton Hershey built a mansion on a hill so he could watch his workers. He constructed a model town based on total control. He gave away his fortune, but retained power. He felt betrayed when workers organized for better wages and conditions. He died alone in a mansion he had donated, surrounded by strangers, no longer relevant to the empire he created. These are not comfortable facts, but they are facts. The Milton Hershey School's $17.4 billion endowment is controversial. The trust spends 1.5% annually while educating 2,000 students. Critics call the spending rate, quote, 27, quote, and, quote, 28, quote. The trust could educate 132,000 students per year at current per-student costs. It educates 2,000. The wealth Milton gave away has multiplied beyond anything he imagined. The entity managing that wealth claims it must adhere to restrictions Milton established in 1909. Whether those restrictions genuinely prevent increased spending or provide convenient justification is debated. No memorial exists for the workers who built the chocolate factory and the town. No plaque honors those who struck in 1937 or were beaten by the mob. No marker commemorates the housemaids who quit 22 times at High Point. Catherine's illness is romanticized as tragic love rather than examined as a disease that isolated both her and Milton. The mansion's role as surveillance post is not emphasized in tours. The wealth accumulation controversy is not highlighted in museum exhibitions. What remains is a narrative of success, philanthropy, and love. Milton Hershey failed repeatedly, then succeeded spectacularly. He married a wonderful woman who died too young. He gave away his fortune to help orphan children. He built a model town during the Depression. He died having created a lasting legacy. This narrative is true. It is also incomplete. 4 tours per Saturday. 12 people each, 48 visitors per week can walk through Milton Hershey's mansion and learn about his love for Catherine, his gift to orphans, his modest approach to wealth. None of them learn about the workers who resented his control. None see the window from which he watched the strike. None hear about the 15 years he spent alone after Catherine died, or the apartment he kept after giving the house away. The mansion tells the story Milton Hershey would have wanted told. The building has won. High Point sits at 100 East Mansion Road in Hershey, Pennsylvania. It overlooks the factory Milton Hershey built in 1905. The factory still operates. The mansion still stands, and both still control the town below them. Milton Hershey built a mansion for love and lived in it alone. He created a model town to care for workers and watch them rebel. He gave away his fortune to orphans and tied it up in trusts that spend almost nothing. He surrendered ownership of everything and controlled it all until death. The contradictions never resolved. Perhaps they were never meant to. High Point was modest for a man of Hershey's wealth. 22 rooms versus Vanderbilt's 250, $100,000 versus $10 million. But modesty was its own form of control. The mansion was not a palace. It was a watchtower. From its windows, Milton could see his factory, his workers, his town. The modest house on the hill was surveillance dressed as humility. Catherine died too young, too slowly, too painfully. Milton loved her genuinely. But his love could not save her, and his control could not ease her suffering. The mansion they built together became his prison after she died. He gave it away because he could not bear to live in it, then kept an apartment because he could not bear to leave. The contradictions multiplied. The 1937 strike broke something in Milton that never healed. He believed his paternalism was benevolence. His workers believed it was control. Both were right. The homes, schools, parks, and jobs were real benefits. So was the resentment they bred. When farmers beat his workers with ice picks, they were defending Milton's vision. When workers sat down in his factory, they were rejecting it. Paradise and prison existed in the same place. American industrialists built monuments, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. Morgan all left behind estates, foundations, institutions. But few gave away their fortunes before death. Fewer still lived to see their gifts become controversial. Milton Hershey created a model town that resented him, a school trust that hoards wealth, and a legacy that requires forgetting half the story to celebrate. The mansion endures because monuments endure. High Point has outlasted everyone who built it, lived in it, loved in it, gave it away, and repurposed it. The building always wins. That was the pattern with the Empire State Building. It is the pattern with High Point. Structures survive, people do not. Memory fades, control passes to those who come after. Tours of High Point Mansion are available through the Hershey Story Museum. Tickets are released on the 15th of each month for the following month. Tours run on Saturdays only. They sell out immediately. The mansion is located at 100 East Mansion Road, Hershey, Pennsylvania. It overlooks the factory, just as Milton intended. Milton Hershey died 80 years ago. His chocolate company generates billions annually. His school educates 2,000 children at no cost. His town thrives as a tourist destination. His mansion houses the trust that manages his wealth, and his name means chocolate, not control. Perhaps that is exactly what he wanted, or perhaps we have simply chosen to remember it that way. The mansion sits on its hill. The factory operates below. The town spreads outward. And every Saturday, 12 people walk through Milton Hershey's home and learn half the story. The other half waits in archives, in strike records, in forgotten worker accounts, in the silence of those who were never memorialized. High Point tells the history its owners want told. The rest remains outside the gate.